There is a photograph that has survived 120 years, and when you see it, you will not immediately understand what you are looking at. It shows a man being held upright by two other men on either side of him. His arms hang like dead weight. His eyes are half closed. His face is the color of ash. He appears to be shuffling forward, barely, as if his legs have forgotten their purpose. Those two men on either side are not helping him celebrate. They are the only reason he is still moving. And the man they are holding up is about to receive an Olympic gold medal. His name was Thomas Hicks, and what happened to him on August 30th, 1904, in the city of St. Louis, Missouri, is one of the most extraordinary and deliberately buried stories in the history of sport. Not because Hicks cheated, he did not. Not because the wrong man won. He was the legitimate champion by every rule that existed. But because what was done to him, what was done to every man on that course that afternoon, was so grotesque, so recklessly dangerous, and so thoroughly sanctioned by the people in charge, that the institution responsible spent the next century quietly hoping no one would look too closely. Stay with this until the end, because this story does not end with Hicks. It ends with something that still governs every Olympic athlete alive today. And it begins with a decision made by one man who believed, sincerely and completely wrongly, that giving athletes water was bad for them. The year was 1904. America was hosting the Olympics for the first time, or trying to. The Games had originally been awarded to Chicago, but a well-funded political machine in Missouri had essentially stolen them by threatening to hold a competing athletic festival at their World's Fair, unless the IOC handed over the Olympics too. Pierre de Coubertin, the Frenchman who had invented the modern games, reluctantly agreed. He was so disgusted with the entire situation that he refused to attend. He would later write that he had a sense, before it even began, that the Olympics would match what he called the mediocrity of the town. He was being charitable. The 1904 St. Louis Olympics were less a sporting competition than a sideshow attraction, a sprawling, disorganized spectacle stapled to a World's Fair that barely noticed they were happening. Most of the world's top athletes hadn't bothered to make the trip to a landlocked Missouri city in the middle of August. The events were muddled together with World's Fair carnival competitions until no one was entirely certain which results were official and which were not. The man in charge of organizing the athletic program was James Edward Sullivan, a bullish American sports official who held the conviction that his instincts about physical performance were superior to the emerging science of the era. He would have an opportunity to test that conviction on August 30th. The test would nearly kill several people. The marathon started at 3 in the afternoon, not in the early morning when temperatures are manageable, not even at midday, at 3 o'clock when the August St. Louis heat was at its most savage, 90 degrees Fahrenheit, humidity to match, the air sitting on you like a wet coat you cannot remove. The course was 24.85 miles of unpaved dirt road winding through 7 hills, coated inches deep in loose dust. And the officials who were supposed to be monitoring the race were riding in automobiles directly ahead of the runners, churning that dust into great choking clouds that the athletes then ran directly through, mile after mile. It was, as one contemporary account put it, less like civil engineering and more like cooking. 32 men started the race. By the end, 18 of them would not finish. But that number barely captures what happened on that road. At the 8-mile mark, a California runner named William Garcia collapsed on the roadside. When doctors finally reached him, they found that the dust had coated the lining of his esophagus and physically torn his stomach open. He was hemorrhaging internally. The medical team later estimated that another hour without treatment would have killed him. He was the lucky one, in the sense that someone found him in time. Out on the course, no one else knew this had happened. The race just continued. At the 9-mile mark, the early favorite, a New York bricklayer named Fred Lors, developed severe cramps and dropped out entirely. He flagged down one of the passing automobiles and hitched a ride toward the stadium. The car traveled 11 miles before its engine gave out, at which point Lors, feeling considerably recovered, stepped out and simply rejoined the race. He jogged the remaining 5 miles to the finish line, crossed it first, was greeted by a roaring crowd, and stood for photographs with Alice Roosevelt, the daughter of the President of the United States, while officials prepared to place a gold medal around his neck. He let all of this happen. He later claimed it was a joke. Officials did not find it amusing. He was banned for life, a sentence that was later reduced on the grounds that he had been, in the official record, temporarily insane. But here is the thing that the Lors story tends to swallow, because it is so remarkable that it becomes the whole headline. While Lors was riding in a car, Thomas Hicks was suffering on a dirt road in the Missouri heat, being kept alive and moving by a 2-man support team, using a method that today would result in immediate criminal charges. From the 10-mile mark onward, Hicks had been begging for water. His handlers refused, not out of cruelty exactly, but because of a theory, James Sullivan's theory, that drinking water during athletic competition was not merely unnecessary, but actively harmful to performance. Sullivan had deliberately placed a single water station on the entire 24.85-mile course. 1. In 90-degree heat, on a dusty road, because he wanted to study what he called purposeful dehydration. The Olympic marathon had become an unauthorized medical experiment, and the athletes had not been told they were the subjects. Hicks's support team, watching their man deteriorate, made a decision. They could not give him water. But there were other options. At the 17-mile mark, his lead handler, Charles Lucas, produced a vial of strychnine sulfate mixed with raw egg whites and administered it to the struggling runner. Strychnine, rat poison. In small doses, it produces a jolt to the nervous system, a kind of forced mobilization of muscle. It was not illegal. There were no rules against it. Lucas considered it a medical intervention, a restorative, the kind of thing responsible trainers did. Hicks took the dose and kept moving. He began to hallucinate. Race observers noted that he appeared to believe the finish line was still 20 miles away, even as he approached the final stretch. His face had gone from flushed to ashen. His arms were barely swinging. A witness described his eyes as dull and lusterless, his knees nearly locked. At the 20-mile mark, with the course still not finished, Lucas gave him a second dose of strychnine, this time with brandy to wash it down. Then warm water was poured over his head and body. He briefly rallied. He was, by this point, moving in what one official described as a purely mechanical fashion, like a machine running on its last reserves of fuel, with no awareness of what was happening around him. The 2 men on either side of Hicks in that photograph were holding him upright as he crossed the finish line, because he could no longer do it himself. He had won the Olympic gold medal. He required 4 doctors and over an hour of treatment before he was stable enough to leave the stadium. One more dose of what Lucas had been giving him, the doctors later concluded, would likely have killed him. He never ran a marathon again. Now pause here for just a moment, because this is where the story shifts from the absurd to something more deliberate. Hicks was poisoned. Garcia nearly bled to death in a ditch. 18 men couldn't finish the race. The man in charge had removed the water supply as an experiment. The course was actively dangerous. Half the field collapsed. And the person responsible for all of it, James Sullivan, looked at the aftermath and initially called the event indefensible. He said he personally opposed the marathon's return and believed it should not come back in 1908. And then, 2 days later, when the St. Louis Post-Dispatch published a front-page account calling the race a man-killing event, Sullivan reversed himself completely. He called the race an impossible challenge on human endurance, which was technically true, since he had made it one. He did not mention the water supply. He did not mention the dehydration experiment. He moved on. But before we follow him, there are 2 men who were on that course who deserve more than a footnote. Len Torniani and Jan Masciani, Botswana men from South Africa. They were the first black Africans to ever compete in the modern Olympic Games. They had not been recruited as athletes. They were in St. Louis as part of the South African exhibit at the World's Fair, a living display, the kind of colonial spectacle that fairs of that era regularly staged for the entertainment of white audiences. When the marathon opened its entry, they were added to the field. Torniani was running a strong race, tracking toward a potential medal finish, when a pack of wild dogs gave chase and forced him a full mile off the course. He still finished 9th. The official Olympic record of the 1904 Games does not spend much time on either of them. They were the first. The Games did not seem to notice. And then there was Felix Carvajal. Cuba's entry in the marathon had traveled to the United States by foot, running the length of Cuba to raise enough money for the trip, then lost every cent gambling in New Orleans. He hitchhiked to St. Louis. He arrived at the starting line wearing heavy street shoes, long dark trousers, and a long-sleeved dress shirt. A fellow competitor took scissors and cut the trousers off at the knee before the gun fired. During the race, hungry because he hadn't eaten in 2 days, Carvajal spotted a spectator eating peaches, asked politely if he could have one, was refused, and stole both. Later, he wandered off the course into an orchard, ate several apples that turned out to be rotten, developed agonizing stomach cramps, lay down on the side of the road, and took a nap. He woke up, resumed running, and finished 4th. He came within a stomach cramp of a bronze medal. He remains one of the most extraordinary athletes in Olympic history, and virtually no one knows his name. What happened next is the part of this story that never makes the highlight reel, because it is quiet and institutional, and therefore easier to ignore than rat poison and stolen peaches. The marathon nearly died. After 1904, serious voices within the Olympic movement called for the event to be abolished permanently. The argument was not unreasonable. The race had nearly killed multiple competitors, produced a fraudulent winner, been won by a man who was technically a walking medical emergency, and the whole thing had been overseen by an organizer who used it as an unconsented science experiment. De Coubertin himself was reportedly skeptical of the marathon's survival. For a period of time in late 1904 and into 1905, it was genuinely uncertain whether you would ever again see a marathon at an Olympic Games. It survived. And the reason it survived contains one final irony that the official history tends to elide. When the marathon returned at the 1908 London Olympics, it came with something new. A rule. Rule 4 of the marathon regulations read, "No competitor, either at the start or during the race, may take or receive any drug." The breach of this rule will operate as a disqualification. It was the first formal anti-doping rule in the history of the modern Olympics. It was written directly because of what Charles Lucas had poured down Thomas Hicks's throat on a dusty Missouri road. The rule would go largely unenforced for years. The 1908 marathon winner's trainers openly gave him strychnine during the race, and he kept the medal. But the principle had been established. A line had been drawn. That line, extended and reinforced decade after decade, eventually became the World Anti-Doping Agency, the banned substance lists, the Olympic testing protocols, the entire architecture of clean sport as it exists today. Every drug test administered at every Olympics since 1968. Every athlete who has ever been stripped of a medal for a failed test. Every clean competitor who trained for years knowing the rules existed and were enforced. Every piece of that structure traces back, in a direct institutional line, to the afternoon a desperate man's handlers fed him rat poison, because the man in charge had taken away the water. Thomas Hicks won a gold medal. He won it hallucinating on a dirt road in 90-degree heat, while his own support team tried to keep him alive with a substance used to kill rats. The institution that put him on that course called the result legitimate, handed him the medal, and spent the next century treating the race as a colorful footnote. Too strange to take seriously. Too embarrassing to examine closely. But the trees knew. The ice cores and the dendrochronology and the genetic analysis. Those tools belong to a different story. What we have here are the photographs, the finish line, the 4 doctors, the man who never ran another marathon, and a rule written 4 years later that began with the words, "No competitor may take or receive any drug." Words that exist because someone, somewhere, decided that what happened in St. Louis was something that must never happen again. They were right about that. They just made sure it took as long as possible to say it out loud.